What's up, guys? Chris Schwartz-Edmisten here from Schwartz-Edmisten Web Design. In the last video, we looked at Squarespace's new scrolling block they just added to version 7.1, as well as some inspiration sites that use scrolling text in really creative ways. So in today's video, we're going to go over CSS for making the scrolling block full width, as well as the CSS for the other two website designs we looked at in the last video. So I'm here in this 7.1 site, and I've gone ahead and added a scrolling block to a new section on this page, but I want to make this scrolling block full width. So we're kind of going after this same design here, where the scrolling text goes all the way across the page. So that's what we're going to look at first. I'll need to go ahead and go to my custom CSS window. And the first thing I'm going to do is I want to limit my CSS to just this one section, because we're not affecting the scrolling block itself. The CSS that we're going to be adding is targeting the section and removing the padding, which limits the width of the content. So if I click done, we can right click on the section and click inspect, and that'll bring up the Chrome inspect window. And this is how we can see the actual HTML of the page. So you'll see, like, right here is the section that this content is in, and we can see it has a section element type. And then if we scroll down, we have this content wrapper class inside. And as I hover over it, you can see it highlighted on the page. There's green surrounding it, and there's green on the top and bottom, and then there's also green on the left. So the green represents the padding on this element. And we can see here on the right-hand side, there's padding on the right of 4 viewport width units and padding on the left of 4 viewport width units. So what we need to do is we need to target this one section and then target the content wrapper class inside and set the padding on the left and right to 0. And then it also gets a maximum width set on it. And that comes from the spacing panel. We can set a site max width, and then this value comes from the site margin that we set in the spacing panel. So basically we just need to set this to 100% and set the padding on the left and right to 0. And that will start to allow the block to become full width. So the first thing I'm going to do is target the section by targeting its data section ID. So I'll double click on the data section ID, Control A to select everything, Control C to copy. And then we target data sections, data elements in CSS by opening brackets. So I'm going to open brackets, paste in that data section ID, and then I'm going to open up some curly brackets. So now any element that we target in here will be limited to this one section. So now remember, we want to target that content wrapper class inside. So I'm going to double click on the name, copy that, and then paste it into the custom CSS window. And now I'll open up some curly brackets. And remember, we need to set the padding right to 0. And I'm going to add an important tag to make sure that our styling is overriding Squarespace's. And then I'll just copy that, and we'll change this to a padding left, because we also need to set the padding on the left to 0. So the thing that's kind of holding it back from still being full screen is that max width. So we need to set the maximum width to be able to be 100%. So we'll go 100% and add an important tag on that as well. And important tags are just kind of, they're specificity hammers, I would say. It's like, it doesn't matter what previous styling has been applied to this element. Make sure that our styles override those previous styles. So that's why we're using that important tag. So now if I go full screen, it's going full screen, but we get a little bit of this horizontal scroll bar. That's because there's a couple things happening. So if I right click on the block, we can scroll up until we find the marquee block in its column. So every Squarespace block gets padding of 17 pixels. So if I scroll down, we can see that this block on the left and the right has padding of 17 pixels. So because Squarespace knows every block has padding on it, on the row, they apply a negative margin of 17 pixels to offset that padding that the block has. So this is actually pulling the block off the page, and that's why we get this horizontal scroll bar. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to target the row in this section and make sure that it has a margin of 0. So right below, I'm going to target the row. And I just want to make sure I'm targeting that correctly. Let's use the SQS row class. And we use a period to target classes. So .sqs row, I've opened up curly brackets here, and now I'm going to set the margin to 0, and I'll add an important tag. And so now it's no longer pulling that block off the page, so we don't have the horizontal scroll bar, but now you can really see that 17 pixels of padding on the left and the right. So what we'll need to do now is just go ahead and target the marquee block using this class of marquee-block. And so I'll drop down below. Again, we target classes with a period in CSS. .marquee block, I've opened up curly brackets, and now we can set the padding to 0 and add an important tag. So now this is how you create a full width scrolling block. That's the final CSS. We don't have any horizontal scroll bar, which is great. The block is totally flush with the edges of the screen. And if we go down to mobile, it'll be the same thing. So the block is flush going full screen. So that's the first design that we looked at. If that's all you wanted to know, then you're good. You can leave the video. But we're going to look at how to create this kind of cool parallax design where all three of them are going different speeds, and we're going to talk about that CSS next. So I've set up an example page, my 404 page here, and all I've done here for the scrolling blocks is I've added a scrolling block, and I've set the text size to be really big, 9.5 rem, and then I have the speed on this one as the slowest speed. Then I have a line block, then I have another scrolling block, and this one is also 9.5 rem, but this time the speed is 1, and then on the bottom, this is another line block, and this is another line block. And then on this last one, I have 9.5 rem for the size, but this time the speed is turned all the way up. So they're all going different speeds, and it gives it that kind of cool like parallax effect. So I'm going to talk about how we're going to get this full width, and as well as right now the content on the Squarespace site feels really far away. So I'm going to talk about how to get the items a little bit closer to the line blocks. So for this one, we're going to go ahead and copy the CSS because we do want this section to be full width. So we just need to update the data section ID to be compatible with this section because right now this is using the previous data section ID. So there's a really cool extension for getting data section IDs and also block IDs, and it's called the Squarespace block identifier. So I'm going to link to that in the description below this video. I highly recommend it. It's a Chrome extension, and I think there's a Mozilla extension as well, but I prefer working in Chrome. And when you click it, it brings up the data section ID and also block ID, as well as collection ID for the page. So it's an easy way to just kind of find the targeting for different elements on the page really quickly. So I'll go ahead and use that to copy the data section ID for this section, and I can replace this previous one. Boom. So now this is going full width, but you can see the marquee block is going full width, but not the line block. And that's because remember, we've removed the padding on the marquee block, but not the line block. Well, every block in Squarespace gets a SQS block class on it. So you can see it doesn't matter if it's the marquee block or the horizontal rule block, they all get this SQS block class. So what I'll do is I'll change this to SQS block, and now the line block can be full width as well. So that's exactly what we want. So we get this cool kind of like full screen parallax effect. But I'll also talk about how to make the lines a little bit thicker and how to make the text a little bit closer to the lines. So if we right click on the line block and we'll find the horizontal rule block here, we'll go ahead and open it up and we get this SQS block content, and then we get the HR, and this is the actual line block itself. So you can see on the actual HR element in the horizontal rule block, we get a height of 1 pixel. So if I wanted to make that line a little bit thicker, what I can do is I can target the horizontal rule block by that class. So I'll go ahead and add a period, target that class, and then we're going to target that HR element inside of that class, and we're going to give it a height of 2 pixels. Now you can see that's a way to make the line block a little bit thicker, whereas by the default, it's just 1 pixel. but you might have noticed that the HR also has margin on the top and the bottom. So when I hover over this element, that's the orange on the top and the bottom. So it's getting a margin of 0.5 em on the top and the bottom. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change this margin to 0 and add an important tag. And so that, if we get rid of this, you'll see everything is a little bit farther away and the line is skinnier. And if we add that back, everything is a little bit closer together and the line is a little bit thicker. So that's how we've basically just replicated this page here, this full width kind of parallax scrolling. And we've done that really quickly on this 404 page. And the cool thing is I've added a link to each one that just goes back to the home page. So if someone were to click on anywhere on this page pretty much, it would take them right back to the home page. So that's how you can create kind of a cool parallax effect with multiple different scrolling blocks. So the last effect that I want to look at is this really cool effect where this designer has the scrolling blocks at an angle, and then the two of them are going to the left and one of them is going to the right. And then this middle one is also outlined as opposed to solid. So let's go ahead and take a look at how to create that really cool effect. So on the home page, I have my setup here. Very similar to the 404 page. I have 3 scrolling blocks divided by 2 line blocks. And these two are just going to the left and this one is going to the right. And that's the entire setup for this section, just 3 scrolling blocks and 2 line blocks. So what I'm going to do is I'll go ahead and copy the previous CSS that we did for the 404 page, and we're just going to build off of that one. So I'll copy that. I'll go ahead and copy the data section ID for this new section and update that. And now we have full screen scrolling blocks in this one, and our line block is a little bit thicker now. So what we want to do is we want to rotate this block. And the way that we can do that is, if you'll remember the content wrapper class, so everything, all the content in this section is housed in this content wrapper class. So instead of trying to rotate every individual line block and marquee block, what we can do is we can just rotate the element that everything is sitting in. So it's just much easier that way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to this content wrapper class, and we can rotate things with transform and then rotate, and then we can rotate them a certain degree amount. So in this case, I know because I've done this before, -10 degrees is the rotation amount that I want. So you can see this is kind of mimicking that same rotation that he has. Ours is a little bit steeper, but I'm just going to go with it. This setup it has the rotation, but you can see the whole, like, divs are squares in web design. So the whole square has shifted, and now you can see the edge of the square on the screen. And up here, you can see these letters being cut off as well. So we need to basically make this square bigger so that the rotated corners can make it all the way to the end of the screen. And the way that we can do that is by adding a transform scale. Now, one thing in CSS with the transform property is if we were to add a scale here of, like, we'll do 1.1, for example. So it'll make it 1.1 times however big it was before. And you can see that works. It's now bigger than it was before. If I get rid of these, this is how it was originally. And now it's applying that scale, but we've lost the rotation. And that's because this transform property is overriding this previous transform property. So if you want to do 2 transforms, what you do is you just put them together. So we're going to put the scale right after the rotate. And now you can see it has scaled up and it keeps its rotation. Now we can play around with this value until we get the edge of the cutoff corner all the way to the edge of the screen. So maybe 1.08. You know, I don't want it to be too much bigger than the screen, but I want to make sure that that corner gets to the edge. So let's do 1.09. And now it looks like nothing is getting cut off. But if you have a trained eye, you might notice that at the very bottom corner here, we're getting a cutoff on the bottom of the section. And that's because the section below it is technically it's stacked above previous sections. So this section is stacked above the previous section. This section is stacked above the previous section. That's just how stacking works in HTML. So because the sections below previous sections are stacked above them, we're getting this content being cut off by the section below. So what we can do is we can come up to this section as a whole and give it a z-index of 1. And that will just stack it above the section below it. So now we're not getting that slight little cutoff anymore. So it's looking pretty close to our finished design, but there's a couple more changes that I want to make first. So the next thing that I want to do is target this center line here, and I want to make this text outlined as opposed to being solid, but I want to keep the other two solid. So if I right click on this element and click inspect, we can see the structure of the marquee. And if I open up this first text element and then open up the text path, we can see that these are actually SVG elements. Squarespace isn't using like paragraphs or something like that. They're SVG elements that are making up all the words in the marquee. So we can use SVG properties on these elements. So we have the ability to set their fill to none and to add a stroke using the SVG properties. So I'm going to go ahead and target. You can see every element in the marquee has this marquee SVG text class. So that's how I'm going to be targeting these elements. I'll add a period and then I'll target that class and I'll open up some curly brackets. But if I were to change the CSS for just like this, I would be changing all three, and I only want to change the second one. So what I can do is I can use my block identifier extension to copy the block ID for only this second block, and I'll put that before the marquee SVG text. And notice I have a space in between, and that's because we want to target this element that's inside of this previous element. So I'm going to go ahead and set the fill to none, and the text disappears. We want to set a stroke color, so a stroke to black, and then you can also change the stroke width if you want. So like if we want to make it a little bolder, we can set it to 2, maybe even a little bit bolder than that. I'll set it to 3. So now you can see we've targeted just the second text and we've made it outlined. So that's kind of a cool some contrast compared to the other two. And then the next thing that we want to do is we have this huge like overflow here. So we want to make sure that we get rid of that. And the easiest way to do that is just to come down below and we'll target the body and we'll set an overflow X to hidden. And that just on the body of the page, we're just making sure that if there's anything that overflows on the left or the right, we just ignore that content basically. It just gets cut off as opposed to having that horizontal scroll bar. Now the last thing that we can do is get this content a little bit closer together. So you can see in this example, there's less space than we have here. If I increase it, you can see as the screen gets bigger, we get much more space. So one thing that we can do is we can target the text and decrease the line height. So if I scroll all the way up in the marquee block, we can see that because I have the style set to heading in the marquee block, in the scrolling block settings, we get a heading of H1, and the H1 headings in a marquee have a line height of 1.4. So basically, I just want to change that to be much lower. So I'm going to target that marquee block. And then I'm going to target the H1. And again, we're just targeting the marquee block here. Oh, that should be lowercase. And then we're targeting the H1 inside of it. And then we're going to set the line height to, let's do like 0.8 and see how that goes. Important. Make sure we have our closing semicolon, and nothing happens until you refresh the page. And now you can see the content is much closer. And the interesting thing about setting a different line height is that if we get rid of our transform and then resize it, you can see like a line height of less than 1 means the content will be cut off. So you can see it's totally cut off here and it doesn't look good. But for some reason, when we add the transform in, we can then change the line height less than 1. And instead of cutting off the content, it seems to just scoot it closer together. So something that I've discovered there. We have lost the scrolling. If I were to reload the frame, it'll start scrolling again though. So just an interesting thing that I've noticed there, just be careful when you're changing line heights. I've tested this extensively, so I know that it doesn't cause problems and it just ends up scooting the content closer together. So that's it. That's that kind of cool angled effect here. And it's just really creative and adds just a really cool design to the page. So that's how you make the scrolling block full width, as well as a CSS for some really creative scrolling text designs. The goal of my channel is not only to show you CSS customizations for Squarespace like this, but to teach it in a way that makes CSS less intimidating. So if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it in the future, consider subscribing to the channel, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.